For those that have not met us before, my name's Robin Bennett. I'm one of the co-founders of the Doggeroos, and Susan Briggs is obviously here. She is the other co-founder. And our topic today is going to be all about emergency evacuation plans.
And look who just joined us.
Oh, Sonia. Good timing, Sonia, because we're going to talk about your book, among other things. Um, so the emergency evacuation plans, we haven't talked about this in a while, but for many of you are probably aware, there was a really horrific and sad tragedy that happened about a week ago now, maybe 10 days ago, where a fire broke out in a pet care facility. And sadly, it was, I don't know the cause of the fire yet. It has not been determined. It was determined that it was not arson. So it was some type of accidental fire, but it happened at night, like 11, so 11, little after 11 o'clock at night. Sadly, all of the animals that were in the facility were killed. And it's horrible. It's a horrendous, tragic situation, but it led a lot of people to start saying they need to rethink or relook at their emergency evacuation plans. So that's what we want to talk about. And we know that there's a lot of various situations that can happen, not just fires, but tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and floods. And in my area, it's wildfires. So depending on where you live, you probably know what the most common possible disaster is facing your facility. And we just want to talk about some of the things you should be doing to, or at least thinking through when it comes to care of the pet. Those of you who have spent any time with me and Susan and listened to us talking about why you should price your services properly and why you should be making money and why you cannot settle for burning yourself out and taking not much money out of your business, and why it's important to set your prices in a way that will make you a profit, is because you're caring for living animals and you have the burden of the stress of all the stuff we're about to talk about on your shoulders. So if you are in one of those situations where, oh, this is kind of a hobby, first of all, it's a hobby with some serious ramifications if things go wrong. And second of all, you do want to take great care of the pet, so you should be getting paid for it to cover all of the care and feeding of the animals, but also all of the stuff that we're about to talk about today. Try not to be too much on my soapbox today, but it might be hard not to.
Yeah, this is a hard topic, but I think it's definitely one that's important to talk about and to take action on. And so I think the first thing everybody should do if they don't have it is get Sonia's book, because Sonia does a great job in here talking about the different disasters and has a template for an evacuation plan. So that's just first step. And Sonia, feel free to chime in as we go along. I was in hurricane. I am still in hurricane, and Bree in New Orleans I don't know if she evacuated with us last one. And so we definitely had, an evacuation plan. And I really came to appreciate hurricanes because we generally have warning that they're coming. And so you have time to prepare and have an evacuation plan in place. But more than that, it's a plan to how are you going to communicate with clients? A lot of this relates to communication about, are you open? Are you closed? Do they need to pick up animals? Can your facility withstand the natural disaster? Most can't. And my lesson learned was it's tough to stay, even if you have our building was made out of concrete block, but what we didn't anticipate was loss of power. And then the floors getting really slick. So then it became dangerous for us and our staff to even be trying to walk dogs on floors that were really slippery. We didn't lose power for that long, but it really opened my eyes. And after going through a couple of situations, I think the responsibility is so high trying to take care of animals in a disaster that you're almost better off not doing it.
Yeah, and I know in particular for those hurricanes where you do have advance notice, I know we typically recommend that people have in place a way that they can contact the owners and have owners pick their dogs up. If they don't, you should have an additional fee that's
Yeah.
going to cover the additional cost to keep those pets or to evacuate those pets, either way. And it should be a significant cost. I'm not talking like $50. It should be a lot, because it's really stressful. I know when we had, not this past year, but it was like 2 years ago when we talked to Gretchen, and I don't remember
Yes.
which hurricane that was now. It might have been Harvey, actually, where they had flooding too. But I remember one of the very distinct things that we talked with them about was most evacuation plans take into consideration that there's going to be staff. Oh, we have these people that live so close to us and they'll be able to help. Or even maybe you live on premises, or maybe you live really close to the facility. So you're going to go in. And guess what? It doesn't always work that way. I remember Gretchen couldn't even get to her facility because flooding was so bad. And then a lot of times your staff may have every intention of coming into work, but you don't know what's going on in their life at the time that disaster might happen. It's very likely that they have family members that they're going to take priority over coming into work. Or you, same thing. You might have every intention of going in, but now maybe your family needs you. So don't necessarily, the lesson we learned from that was don't necessarily count on every person who said, "Yeah, I'll be able to come in case of emergency," actually coming in. And again, that hurricanes are the one thing where you do have some advance notice. You can actually take a day or two to think through what you're doing and get some of the dogs out of there, or put them in a vehicle and take them someplace inland, which is a whole, other liability, but it is something that we've had people do. And if you're going to do that, obviously, have a place where you can go, which sometimes is another pet care facility that's farther from the coast. But let's talk about what happens for those emergency situations where you don't have a lot of planning, like if a fire were to break out, or if you have a sudden tornado where maybe you get a couple of minutes of warning, maybe a tiny bit longer than that. In my area where there's wildfires, normally we're going to get some warning to evacuate prior to having something happen, but those are a lot shorter time frames. So what are some things, Susan, that you would say you really have to consider for those types of disasters?
Yeah, I think you have to have a plan and you have to have practiced it, like thinking through you got to get people out. And just like the fire drills we did at school, everybody needs to know what that is for a disaster and where they go. But then getting animals out is a whole nother level of stress and pressure. And so how do you have leads? Where are you going to take them? If you don't have fenced areas? We didn't have fenced areas. And so we had posts in the ground and we had cables that we could hook up. And then we needed to get all the dogs leashed or in carriers and get them out as quickly as possible and get them connected to that cable. So, what is your plan? And then you've got to have your supplies ready, like the cable and the leads and stuff, got to be easily accessible, and everybody has to know what to do. And for us, that was just going to be like the first staging area. We had a business next door that had a fenced in parking lot, which was like, then we would move them there if we needed to. So, you may have to do a plan that has stages to it. But I think the key is making sure your supplies are always in good working order and that all team members know what to do when an emergency strikes. What is your responsibility?
We had very similar. We had, what was I going to say? Oh, we had a fenced, the second place I had, we had a fenced in area. So our plan was to take them into that fenced in area. But then you figure that my facility at that time, the outdoor area was very small. So if it were something like a fire, they were still pretty close to the building. So I did have to take them out of that fenced in area. And our plan would have been to use a long tether, and there used to be a name for these, and I haven't looked them up in a long time, but it was basically a long tether that had hooks on it where you could tie the tether between two or three posts. And then along that line, there's places to individually attach dogs. We did playing naked. So our daycare, we didn't use collars. So that was my other thing, is at the front and back of each entrance, we had an entrance in the front, entrance in the back. We had a whole stack of kennel leads. We had 50 kennel leads. We never had 50 dogs in our facility, so that was more than we needed. But I had 50 in the front in case we had to go out the front, and 50 in the back. So as that person would leave the building, they could grab those leads. Those leads were never used for anything else. They weren't the leads that we would use day to day. And then the other thing to consider in today's technology world is we printed out every morning. We printed out a list of all the dogs and their pet parents and their phone numbers, emergency contact numbers, every single day. We printed that. Because in my head, I was like, most of us think we can just access that on our internet. We can just log in. But I have yet to see a disaster where the internet doesn't get so overwhelmed that you can't get on things. So in my head, I was like, if we can't get a hold of the database with all the contact people to see whose dog is there and how do I contact them, I just wanted it to be printed. The other reality of that is then you can hand out, like, help, have other people help you call if you need to get in touch with parents to come pick up their dogs or tell them where their dog is or whatever. So we had that on a clipboard again at each exit point in from our facility as well. So I
Make sure everybody's out. You can do that roll call of the dogs and the staff to make sure everybody did get out. And if you care for cats or another thing, you either need like those carrier boxes or pillowcases or something, evacuation type enclosures for every type of animal that you take care of. And they're going to be different. So again, it's assigning and everybody knowing their roles and responsibilities.
So what if you guys have any specific ideas that you found really helpful? If you post those in the comments or if you have questions, we'd love to hear that too. And definitely, Sonia, if tips that you want to provide, we definitely would love to hear those as well. So you can type those in the comments. The other thing I would think we can talk about is not most of what we're talking about is assuming that the disaster happens during the day when
Yeah.
you're fully staffed, or at least fully staffed as you can be right now. But hopefully you have a lot of staff and there's people to react and there's people to help get the dogs out and move them. But what if it happens like first thing in the morning? I know when I opened first thing in the morning, I only had two people on. I specifically had two people open, not because I needed two people to open, but my policy was always I wanted at least two people in the building. Partly that if a dog got hurt and I needed to take them to the vet, I would have one person that could take them to the vet, one person could stay with the other dogs. But also, just from a safety standpoint, we opened early in the morning and I just didn't want to have two people, only one person opening or closing for that matter. But what would happen if I had to get out a ton of dogs at a time when I didn't have much staff? Or if you don't staff overnight, what is your plan for overnight care? How do you even know something's going on? So, those are all things that you need to consider and plan for as well. I probably know more facilities that don't have overnight staff than I do facilities that do have overnight staff. So I'm not necessarily saying, okay, you have to have overnight staff, but if you don't have overnight staff, what's your policy and procedures for if something happens at your facility? And I know, Susan, someone that stayed overnight, didn't you?
We did. And actually, it was interesting. I started with three partners. And when you start, we did the night shifts. And it was the very first night we had an employee spend the night. We had a flood in our facility with 18 inches of water. And he had five dogs and he put them in our cat suites. Our cat suites were really big, but that's what he did. But then it was so stressful because we couldn't get down there. I mean, he did an amazing job, but yeah, having someone overnight is a premium value. And so you definitely need to make sure your pricing reflects that. In hindsight, I don't think I priced enough for that, but it was definitely something we marketed as a safety thing. But then you need to make sure that they are very well versed in how to handle an emergency. I know another facility in Houston, and because we flood a lot down here, unfortunately, they had a gal that actually had the water got so high before she could get dogs out that she was putting them in crates on top of furniture, and it was very traumatic for her. But she again did get all the dogs saved and get them out that they had. But if you have 75, I didn't have that many cat suites. So you have to think about the numbers you're dealing with. We were small then, which we were probably blessed. And so even if you have a person staying overnight, if you have 50 to 75, 100 animals, is it realistic that they can even get them all out unless you just, there's fenced areas where they can just open the doors and hope they go. And then if you do have aggressive animals, that's a risk as well. So there's no good answers, and every facility is set up differently. So you really have to do this planning for your facility, which is where I think Sonia's templates and books can really help you. Overnight staff can help, but I don't think you can rely on that to be the savior for everything.
Yeah, and the other thing is your overnight staff, at some places the overnight staff, it is a sleeping position. So they're there in case they hear something or whatever, but in other places the overnight staff is doing cleaning or paperwork or whatever, so they might be a little bit more aware. But if something were to happen that doesn't have any sound, or you sleep through the earthquake, which I have know people that have done that, or a fire breaks out, that person may not know that the fire has broken out. They can be overcome by smoke just as easily as animals can be. So that becomes an issue as well. So I definitely think there still needs to be other alarm and monitoring systems of
Yeah.
some sort, even if you have overnight staff. Sonia mentioned, this is a great point. Sonia said, have enough crates to hold every dog in the building. Store these outside your facility in an outbuilding if possible, because then if you have to take the dogs out, you've got crates out there, which is a great idea if you have that, that ability to put those crates somewhere. It brings up a really good scenario for those of you that do rotation of dogs. So sometimes facilities are smaller, so they rotate dogs by keeping half of them in an enclosure or a kennel or a crate or one of the boarding suites, and then the other dogs are out playing in daycare, and then they'll rotate those groups. So at any given time, half are out and half are crated, which is great, except as Sonia points out, if you have to evacuate all of them, you have to have crates, enough crates for everybody. Even if you have crates for half the dogs in your building, and then you've got to try to get those outside, you still have to have enough crates for the other half of the dogs that might need to get evacuated as well. So that is definitely something you need to factor into your planning, is if you actually do take the dog somewhere, do you have enough kennels, crates, lines, whatever you're going to use to tether those dogs for every dog that's there. And sometimes we don't think about the whole, we think about here's a group and here's a group and here's a group. And we don't think about the entire group together because you don't usually see them all together. What Susan just mentioned, if you have a daycare where you have only dogs lodging with you that do daycare, it's a little bit easier without as much risk to put them all out together and just say, okay, we're going to let everyone outside right now until we can get everyone leashed and all that. But if you take in, and this is the majority of places, if you take dogs that go to daycare and then you take other dogs that don't do daycare because they don't like being in play groups, you also have to wait to keep those dogs separated. I guess worst case scenario, a fight is better than a death in the building. But at the same point, you want to try to plan in a way that would keep those types of dogs separate. And that's a little bit of a challenge as well. I was telling Susan the other day, it's interesting to think about when Susan and I first got into the daycare industry, back when daycare wasn't normal at all. And all the people that did boarding thought we were crazy. At that time, if you go back and you look at dog daycare or lodging facilities, or what we used to call kennels from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, they all had indoor outdoor runs. Like it was pretty standard to just make a lodging enclosure that was an indoor outdoor run with a guillotine door where you could open the door and dogs would go outside and without having to touch them or anything. And now we laugh at those. We were like, oh, those are like old school and stuff. But when it comes to evacuation, there's something to that. There is something to be said for being able to, without physically touching the dogs, being able to get them outside and then get them from an outdoor location someplace safely. So it is something to consider. I'm not saying we should all go back and rebuild our facilities, but it is something to look at versus like my first facility was all indoors. And so trying to get those, it was a small facility, so we didn't have that many dogs, but trying to get those dogs indoors to outdoors, it was going to have to happen individually, dog by dog, with physically moving them by a person. So there is something to be said for how your layout is, as well. Now that being said, the other thing we talked about was if you have something like a fire in your building, you can't necessarily just open every door because you can actually make the fire worse.
Right.
So there's that as well. But just in terms of moving the dogs, there's some of the ways that we used to build facilities that made a little bit more sense from the emergency evacuation standpoint.
Yeah, and I think the monitoring and detection is really the first thing to focus on, and that doesn't have to be really expensive. If you don't have a centralized monitoring system that will also detect like carbon monoxide or smoke, get the local ones. You're probably going to have to clean them a lot just because of the hair and stuff that's in a pet care and animal care facility. But it is best to have centralized monitoring for that, because I think in the most recent incident, it probably was the carbon monoxide and smoke that would have been detected first. You want to detect it, and then can you suppress it? There's, I think, different points of view on whether sprinkler systems should be used or not in pet care facilities. And depending on size of building and where you're located, whether that's required in facilities or not. And I know Charlotte was sharing something with us earlier this week. What on that? Do you remember?
I know she was saying in certain states, whether or not you have to have a sprinkler system is dependent on how big the building is and sometimes what it's made out of as well. And there's different rules for people and dogs. So the same building, if you tell the fire department, I'm going to have a play school here or kids school or an office with X number of people, they might require you to have a sprinkler system. Right or wrong, dogs are not given that same status in most states. That is starting to change, but most states will say that you could have the same number of dogs and not be required to have that type of a sprinkler system. So it really does depend on, in terms of whether or not you're going to have it, is going to depend on the state. Whether or not you should have it is a totally separate question you can answer for yourself. But as Susan said, there's some things to consider. Number one, sprinkler systems, and you had that great article, Susan, about that someone did on everything
Mm,
we know about sprinkler systems we learned from the movies and all of
yeah,
us fall.
right.
Except for Die Hard. Die Hard was the one movie they said Die Hard showed how sprinklers work really well. But most of us think that a sprinkler system is the fire goes off someplace and the sprinklers all come on. That's not really how it works. The sprinkler where the fire is will go off. Um, but the fire also has to be hot enough to cause the sprinkler to go off. So if you're in a building like mine, the ceiling was like 30 feet high. And so it was going to be a really big fire before the sprinkler system ever got triggered to begin with. If you're in a smaller facility, it might be worth looking at a suppression system that's where your electrical stuff is,
Mhm.
because that could definitely help. If you're in a building that is a normal profile building with normal ceilings and you can put some kind of suppression system where the most common source of a fire might be, that might be really beneficial. So you can put the fire out or suppress the fire at least before it gets bigger. But the other thing to consider, if you want to talk a little bit about what Ben was talking to you about other animals. So the sprinkler system can actually be downside to going off in certain rooms where you might have
Right.
other.
Like with cats and birds and stuff, that it isn't safe to have, and that actually animals can drown and have other negative side effects. And so it's really something I think to talk to your local fire department about, as well as you have to follow your regulations. But I don't know that sprinklers are the answers, because some fires are smoldering, they're not flame. And so smoldering, I think, is where you have that higher risk of carbon monoxide and smoke versus flame. And that's where you really need the detection. Early detection is going to be key for those situations.
Yeah, and I would definitely say some type of system that is monitoring the smell, like the smoke or odor, carbon monoxide, that kind of thing, that will alert some central system. In addition to letting your staff know, alert somebody that can come and help you to take care of. In the situation that we talked about earlier, where those dogs did die, they did. My understanding is that they did all die of fumes, not from burning. And what happens is we also have talked to some folks who have had this tragedy happen personally. And what they were told is that typically the carbon monoxide will cause the animal, any animal, including a human, to just get really sleepy and want to lay down. And then they end up being killed by it. So you want to have some kind of, if, especially if you don't have overnight staff, and if your overnight staff is sleeping and they aren't aware of this, then they're likely to die as well, which is obviously not what we want. So having some kind of monitoring system where it will detect when that's happening and alert the fire department or alert your team and whatever, and so you can take action. And I would do that whether you have staff or not. So we had a couple of questions. This was a great question from my friend in
Yeah.
Virginia, Lana, as a dog parent. And I love this because she is coming at it from the parent side of it. If a disaster hits, would we need to pick up our pet ASAP if it's safe to do, or would that to add to the chaos of the facility? What were you gonna say?
I would want them picked up. As many animals that get picked up as possible, less
Yeah.
responsibility for our team that's running on adrenaline. So
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to say. It is going to add a little bit to the chaos, but I can tell you that I think it's just one less dog that they have to care for at that particular time, and one more dog that they know is in the safe hands
right.
of their pet parent. So I would probably call in advance and say, "Hey, I'm coming down, and if you want to put him in a crate in the front, I'll run in there and get him," or whatever. And that's a lot of times that is what happens for something like a hurricane, where you know that the hurricane's coming in. Obviously, a little bit harder if it's something you don't have plans for. And obviously, I would make sure it is safe for you, because you don't want to get hurt or injured while you're trying to go get your pet either. But I do think that's a great question to
Yeah.
ask. And I do think it would help them long term if they were able to get other dogs out of their facility so then they don't have to worry about as many. And then
And what I would want to have is really like a sign off procedure so that there was a signature and we were crossing them off the list. They were picked up and what time, just so you didn't then have confusion later or what happened to that dog. So
yeah,
having a documentation on that would be important. The other thing I just have to say, because I've just seen too many floods and it's just so tragic, just personally, with trying to get dogs. You guys that run pet care facilities can help pet parents understand the importance of getting their animals comfortable being in a crate and having crates at home in case they have to evacuate for a flood. I can tell you when Harvey hit, it was just tragic how many animals they got them out of their house. Unfortunately, they either jumped out of the boats because they were scared or fearful, and they drowned later because they either didn't have crates or they weren't used to being in crates. And that a crate can be such a safety piece of equipment, and you can help spread that message to pet parents.
yeah, and we do know a lot of people that don't want to have their dog crate trained, but there are times when your dog needs to get used to being in a crate, even if it just goes in for surgery. They're gonna put, I'm telling you right now, they're gonna put them in an enclosure at the vet's office after the surgery's over and before the surgery happens. And if your dog is not panic stricken, they're already stressed because they're away from home. And now potentially they're in some kind of disaster. If they're at least being able to be okay in a crate, that's going to help them. Lana said she would just Jeep through anything because she has a Jeep too. Jeep through anything to get her pup. Okay, so we had an earlier question. Let me go find it again real quick about communicating. How you communicate? How would you communicate? Forget the exact question. And now there's too many comments here. I can't.
I think I found it. How you
All the time,
recommend?
but oh, here it is. How do you recommend communicating clients that your facility has a disaster plan? I would totally have it everywhere. I would
Yeah,
be
I think you can have that on the website, and I wouldn't be surprised. I know that places near where this facility was, which happened to be in Central Texas, are being asked about it. So I think you can put it on your website. You might even want to do a flyer of what it is. Every hurricane season, we had a flyer that we would hand out to our clients, telling them what we plan to do in the event that their dog was there when a hurricane hit. And so it was just a piece that we had ready to go every hurricane season. I think it's a great marketing tool and it reinforces your professionalism. So I would shout it from my website, have flyers, and make it part of your tour package. Not everybody does it.
Yeah, and I would also say if you have if you're in an area where you're known for certain disasters, like Susan said, hurricanes in Texas or Florida or whatever, I would make sure that you're communicating that every single year with your clients. For the other stuff that's more like emergency disasters that you're not going to know about, I would make sure that you let your clients know. And I would probably put it on my website that we have these types of monitoring systems, and this is how we contact, this is who gets contacted when those monitoring systems go off. We do have overnight care or we don't have overnight care, whatever that looks like for you. But then if you don't have overnight care, what are you doing to mitigate or account for the safety of the dog? So whatever it is you're doing, I would make sure that people know about that. And I would use that. Susan and I often talk about the fact that most of the folks that listen to our podcast or Facebook Lives or YouTube channel or whatever it is, most of you guys are doing things that are not normal. Most of you guys are going above and beyond what the average daycare does. You just don't think you are. And you think that what you do, everybody's doing. And we always laugh because we're like, no, it is actually great to tell your clients that you do evacuation drills, that you train your staff, that they have body language, that you go to conferences, that you get education, because you guys think everybody does that. I'm just here to tell you, everybody does not do that. So making sure that you're just communicating the stuff that you do as a part of your care for the dogs, that what sets you apart is really
Yeah. Oops, sorry, because I just have to share this because I think this is a great way and reason to sometimes close your facility for a few hours to do specific training and drills. And this would be a great way to say, we're going to be closed for 2 hours today because we're reviewing our disaster preparedness and doing an evacuation drill with our staff. What client can get mad at you over that? And if they do, are they the client you really want? It's a way to ensure everybody gets trained, and then also you're subtly sharing what you're doing to protect and be safe for the pets.
Yeah, and I definitely would let them know you're doing that. And we recommend doing those evacuation drills a couple times a year. And
Yeah.
definitely when you get new staff, you're going to have to do refresher training, but it's good just to refresh for everybody. And just like schools or businesses, or every time, if you've ever gone on a cruise, the very first night of your cruise, you do an evacuation drill for if there something happens with the ship. Same thing. Like, you want to have those front and center of everybody's mind, and make sure that you're training your whole team to be on top of it. But and I would all it's very much like first aid training, because your entire staff should have first aid training too. And that's another time we say close your doors and bring someone in to train your staff, and tell your clients we're closed today to do 2 hours of first aid training so that we can take better care of your pets. It's the same type of principle. So Sonia said, mitigation is the most important part of any plan. How will you prevent the crisis in the first place? Which is an awesome point, particularly for things like fire is probably the most obvious ones, where if there's a lot you can do to keep your facilities more or less prone to catching
Yeah.
on fire. I guess that's the best way to say that. Just like with your house, I wish I had this picture. We went to a restaurant. We were in out of the area, and we went to this restaurant. It was in Buena Vista, Virginia. And I took a picture at the time. I don't have it readily available, but we walked in. It was a great Mexican restaurant, but we walked in, and there was they had the menus on 3 screens. And we were all like, this place is awesome, because you can see the menus. There's 3 screens up there, and we can decide what we want before we get up there to order, where they have the computer. Then I looked over, there's literally like stuck on the wall is one of those big extension cords with 6, where you could plug 6 things into it. And in that 6 things, or like another thing where you could plug 4
Mhm.
more extension cords. And then all I remember thinking was, this is like totally OSHA violation right here.
Yeah.
It's a disaster waiting to happen. You can't have that kind of stuff. So cords where dogs can reach them, too many cords in one plug, like all the basic stuff.
Mhm.
Walk through your building, and I can tell you, because this happens in my house occasionally, you may have problems that you weren't aware of, because your staff might have gone through and said, oh, we need another thing plugged into this, and they might have pulled out an extension cord somewhere. There's also some things that should not be plugged into an extension cord.
Right.
So my pet peeve is always like, my husband's always, just get an extension cord for the crock pot. And I'm like, I had a uncle that worked in a fire department. So I think all my fire safety stuff comes from him. But I'm always, it says you're not supposed to plug the cord in a crock pot into an extension cord. So I never do. I
Mhm.
just push it really close to the wall, wherever the plug is.
Yeah.
So things like that, being aware that there are some appliances that you're not supposed to use extension cords for. And it
Well,
sounds
and
silly, but
yeah, and also making sure you're maintaining all your electrical equipment, like cleaning the hair off the dryers or blow dryers in your groom area, making sure dryer vents are cleaned out. Good maintenance of your equipment is really important, because the most common cause of fire is electrical. And so if you can really emphasize the safety aspect. And unfortunately, hopefully, this tragedy that happened in Texas can help prevent future tragedies. That's all we can hope. And so I would share that with your team, that this really did happen, and it happened recently. And I just can't even imagine being in that owner's shoes or in any of the staff shoes that worked at that place. It would be so devastating. No one wants to go through that. So if you need motivation to get your staff to really understand the risk, share the story if they haven't heard it, and then talk about what they can do to help prevent it. And then it takes everybody to bring up if they see something that could be unsafe.
yeah. And this tragedy that just happened recently, unfortunately, is not the first time that there
Mhm.
have been that pets in a lodging facility have died from specifically a fire. It's not the first time. And that's the sad thing about it. And it's horrible, not just for the pet parents, obviously, who lost their dogs, but I agree with Susan, for your staff, for the community, for the owner. Like, it's devastating across the board. So whatever you can do to prevent that. And I will say, for those that are washing their own stuff, that have their own washers and dryers, the dryer is a huge thing to look at, cleaning out the vents, make sure. And that's something that is just easily overlooked. And then you think, next time I'll do it. And next time I do it. And one load, there's a ton of lint and hair and everything else in
Mhm.
there. So you have to really be on top of it, and really create those processes and procedures that make everybody responsible for the safety overall. It can't just be one person. It can't just be like, I'm the one that's going to inspect all the time. It has to be the whole team effort. So definitely looking at that. All right, a couple other questions we had. Are there recommended slip leads that have multiple loops for 2 to 3 dogs per lead for emergency situations? There was there was one, and I have to go back and look. There used to be one, and it was specifically made for an emergency, which is what we had. That was a long line with a whole bunch of hooks on it. It wasn't what you would walk a dog with. It was specifically made to dogs. I don't know beyond that, Susan, if there's one you can think of.
Yeah, I don't know either, but I think at this point I would just be Sonia has some good resources in her book in the back, and then I would just be Googling or having someone Google and try to find safety equipment.
And then
And
Anne had said when clients sign up for daycare, they have a welcome packet of plans and other things for pet parents to look over at their leisure. So that's another way to let the pet parent know you've thought through these things and you are taking care of it. Because it's not probably you're probably not going to have a pet parent who specifically asks you about this. That's where I feel like we often just don't think about it because nobody's asking about it until something happens. And then now it's, oh my gosh, we need to think about this. So part of why we wanted to have this Facebook Live was just to remind people it has nothing to do with whether or not anyone's asking about it. It has to do with you doing the planning and then letting them know that you're taking care of their dogs. And that's regardless of what service that pet parent is using, whether it's training, grooming, whatever. All those emergency plans need to be in place. Sandy and Brandy actually answered this one way. So Sandy was saying, is there a way to do a drill without stressing out the pets in the facility? Which is a really good question. Some of the stuff that I would be doing, I wouldn't necessarily, probably won't stress the pets out if you can turn it into a game. And someone earlier on had talked about crate games. We
Mhm.
do a lot of crate game training if you're a trainer, you do a lot of that with the dogs, like teaching a dog it's fun to go in a crate and fun to come out and fun to go back in, and it becomes a game. So doing some of that stuff will help. I also think you can do drills with some of the dogs and maybe choosing the dogs that won't really freak out if you're like running with them through the building or that kind of thing. But Brandy also said, and we've recommended this before too, they
Yes.
use stuffed animals 100% the same and gets the point across.
Yeah,
So
you're still trying to put a slip lead around a neck and get in and through the door and the gate. And I love using stuffed animals. So
yeah, so we've recommended that quite a bit. And even if you put 50 stuffed animals, just watch how long it takes you to get them out. And they're
yeah,
not even moving. It
yeah,
does, as Brandy said, it does get the point across because you're going to see the length of time even when the dog's doing nothing and you can literally pick them up and move them without anything. So Anne said any appliance must be plugged directly into a wall and not an extension cord. Fire code regulations must be reviewed by all staff. So that's awesome. And that's just a great policy to have so that you can tell people this is our policy. The more extension cords, the better. Susan and I have worked with vendors in the past who wanted us to. There was one vendor in particular. I won't talk about the product, but the product needed to be plugged in, and they wanted me to recommend it in an enclosure, in a lodging enclosure. And Susan and we had a lot of conversations with this vendor, and I was like, no, I'm just not going to recommend this because basically you're telling me to put a plug into some dog's enclosure.
yeah,
And I don't know why they couldn't figure out that was not a good idea. They were like, oh, what they said was we can cover it and then it won't be accessible. All right. All of you who have lodging enclosures, you tell me how
yeah.
determine
How's that going to work for you?
if they decide they want to get something, they're going to get it. And making sure that your staff is not using electrical cords where the dogs can get to them. That's the reason that we had a battery operated floor scrubber for the same reason. So we could plug it in and out away from where the dogs were. All right, I'm trying not to get on my soapbox here. Let me see what else we have here. Okay, so Samantha said, does anyone know if you can do the safety training yourself? If you have the info or should contact a safety training program? This is actually a really good question. So because I was just going to say, before I even saw your question, Samantha, you can do that safety training yourself. However, if you're talking like a fire department, most fire departments will happily send somebody out to your facility to walk through what they think are the most critical or dangerous scenarios that you have. Usually there's someone within your county or municipality that has the role of helping people create disaster plans. And that person is usually happy to come out and walk through your facility, not just from the safety standpoint, but also just from the evacuation standpoint. So I do think there are some counties that require that kind of a drill to be done, but most of the time that is specific to children or people. and
Mhm.
not necessarily dictated for the animals. But that doesn't mean you can't go and say, hey, I know you do these trainings drills with the school down the street. Can you do it for us? They'd probably be happy to do it because it's helping the community. But I think that's a really good question. And then Ann said, if you have a local fire department, they do offer safety classes. So there you go. Same thing. So that's awesome. Let me see what else. Ann said, I know when I went to a client's home, I smelled gas, got the dog out and took the pet to the hospital, which I came home from my house one time, and this was a couple of years ago. One of my dogs somehow had hit the gas, and the gas
Mm.
was on when I walked in. And the scary thing was my kids got home before me, but they didn't know what that smell was. They didn't think about it. They were like, whatever, it smells in here. So again, teaching your staff some of that, like if you smell gas or if you smell anything, it's better to be safe than try to worry about it.
Yeah,
Smoldering, the smell of sulfur is another thing. The smell of sulfur, or what's the word? Rotten eggs. That smell often indicates a fire that's getting ready to burn, but hasn't actually burned. I forget what the name of that is. But it's basically the beginning of a fire. Electrical fire will sometimes smell like that. So being aware of that kind of stuff and making sure your staff's aware of that as well.
yeah, and anytime you've got a chemical smell or, in the air and there's animals present, they need to be monitored and checked because they can be much more sensitive, especially birds. I think everybody, knows about like the Teflon can kill birds. So there's other chemicals. So any animal that's been exposed to air that has chemicals in it needs to be checked. And so sometimes that can be another type of disaster with you've got a chemical release in your community where you may have to shelter in place and you have to turn off your HVAC and stuff so that you're not bringing in that chemical smell. Those types of things should also be part of your disaster planning, and
Yeah.
it's viewed in Sonia's book to do that as well.
Yeah. And we actually just had that in Colorado because of fires in California. There was a
Mm.
few fires in Colorado, but most of the smoke was coming from California. And we literally, for many days, we got air alerts from the National Weather Service saying if you have allergies or asthma or you're elderly, you should just stay inside. And my I'm telling you, my allergies were I have allergies to pollen and stuff like that, but my eyes were draining and draining. It was just from the smoke. And you couldn't even see it. You could not I could not see the mountains from my house, so I knew it was smoky. But it's not like I could see the smoke literally in my house or whatever. But when I would go outside, it was terrible. So you can only imagine like the effect that would have on animals who are a lot more sensitive to us. All right, last thing, just a quick reminder that in most of your buildings, you're going to be required to have fire extinguishers.
Ah,
There are requirements to inspect your fire extinguisher. And if you do have a fire marshal that comes out periodically, which we always did, our fire marshal came out once a year. That's one of the main things they look out. But if you don't have a fire marshal that comes out or fire person from the fire department that comes out, you need to check those things because there is a date on them. There's an expiration date. You should also be shaking them occasionally to make sure that all the stuff doesn't settle in the bottom. And you should make sure that you have the right type of fire extinguisher for wherever you have the fire extinguisher located. So there are different, generally speaking, there's electrical fire extinguishers are different from like a grease fire extinguisher. So you want to make sure that all of that is set. And I would have more fire extinguishers than you think you need. Because again, what is required by law generally is not effective in a place where there's a lot of different rooms and a lot of different enclosures and that kind of thing. So I would be looking at, can my staff get to one pretty quickly? And if they have to run through four rooms to get the one fire extinguisher to run back through those four rooms to put out a fire, that's not going to be enough. So making sure that you have enough fire extinguishers and that you're checking them to make sure that they're still serviceable every single year on a routine basis. That should be part of your planning as well. All right. Okay, I didn't think we'd talk this long on this
I
topic.
know.
Apparently, it's a big topic. And it really is. It's again, this is the you are taking care of people's living pets that they love, and you have all the responsibility, and it's a huge responsibility. So you want to make sure that you're doing everything to mitigate any kind of problem and that you've got plans in place disaster happens. And this is again why we say price yourself so that it is worth it. It is worth it to take on all this stress as well. You want to make sure that you can afford to put the right safety measures in place, as well as pay your staff and pay yourself and all of that. But and our biggest recommendation is to get Sonia get her book, because that's going to be the number one resource for pet care facilities. It's a great book. And Sonia, we appreciate that you have
Yes.
written this book. It literally is the greatest book. And we found out that book really before we really even met Sonia. So this isn't like she paid us to promote her stuff. It's great that she's here, but it really is a really good book. So if you don't have it, it should be a Bible in your facility and you should be reviewing it frequently.
Yes.
All right. I think
And we
that's
hope you never have to use it. However, you'll sleep
exactly.
better at night knowing you have it in place.
Exactly. Okay, last comment is that I am putting the link into our Facebook group. We do have a Facebook group. Oh, I'll put the link into Sonia's book again, but the book is Harry Situations, Crisis Planning. And you can get it on Amazon or Dogwise, or just Google it and you'll find it. I'm putting a link in there to, I just put a link into Amazon as well for that.